if you are a landlord, new landlord, make sure you never paint over the hardware, even if your hardware already is existing. Okay. Number one, let's talk about what you said you've learned from me with respect to real estate.
Oh, yeah.
Being in this position and everything.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things, well, first of all, let me take a step back. And essentially every single time I see like anyone in my friend group, they're always like, oh, because we love talking about real estate and trying to get started, and everyone's kind of at different stages, but everyone's like trying to do something. And all the time a deal will come up and they're like, hey, like what would Dan do with this deal? What would Dan do in this situation? Because obviously like a lot of them watch your videos and everything, and they're curious to be like, okay, what would he do if he was in my position right now, based on my financial scenario, based on the market conditions, based on how much money I have saved up, yada, yada, yada. And so one of the things that I've realized through, I guess, the last couple of years working with you, and some of the feedback that I get from when I'm talking about this with my friends, is they'll say, like they'll be worrying about sometimes like the smallest little things that really don't matter all that much at all.
With respect to the property or something?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And then it's kind of like boils down to that you really only look at a few kind of key things, and that a lot of shit doesn't actually matter as much as a lot of beginners think that it matters, right?
Like,
so,
what would they be looking at that would kind of get them all worked up?
like even like things that, like, for example, things just overthinking the like improvements that you might do to a place. Like you walk in and like you might look at something and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna do this, this, and this, and then within 10 minutes you have like a pretty good idea of like what the property needs. But somebody else, they might be like looking at all of these other things that just doesn't matter. They'll be looking at like adding certain tiling jobs or adding certain like features to the property that makes it like unique, or like adding this, like whether or not to include like a furniture package in like the rental or whatever. Just like a lot of shit that just doesn't matter, right? Like at the end of the day, it boils down to like a few if you're gonna be doing improvements to a property, like I hear from you, it's a few basic things. You focus on those things. Don't do really, really cheap quality, because then you're just gonna be replacing it again soon. Don't do anything expensive that's outside of what like the comparable units are like in the area. Just choose a reasonable finish that's very generic and that people would be happy with, and like call it a day. I think people are like spending so much time focusing on these like nitty gritty, or for example, like they'll spend so much time analyzing one property, like weeks upon weeks and hours analyzing like one property, which I get it. Like if it's your very first one, I kind of compare it to maybe you when you're analyzing like some of the larger like US deals. You'll be spending a lot of time researching it. Maybe you'll get to a certain point in time where you'll look at a 100-unit building and in 30 minutes you're like, yep, that's good enough for me.
I don't spend that much time.
Yeah?
Not really.
Do you find that you're spending a lot less the more that you're looking at them?
Yeah.
Because you're learning kind of like what to look for?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm getting more comfortable. I understand different markets. I know what to look for. I have a system down now. You know, where I kind of follow like a flow, and I kind of know what I used to find myself doing is trying to make it work, versus if I come across something that I just don't like right off the hop, then I just move on from it. I don't try to belabor it and try to make that particular property work. You're always going to find things that work and don't work. But if there's like a glaring thing that doesn't work, I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Whereas before I was so like hungry to do this that I'd always try to make things work. And then I'd get down the path and end with the same result, but spend too much time to get to that one result, because initially I should have simply taken my own advice or listen to my own gut and tell myself, okay, well, here's an issue. We need to cut it loose regardless right now before we get deeper in and like, you know, maybe start, you know, incurring expenses and things like that.
Yeah. And I can't emphasize enough, like, to anyone that's listening, about how important that speed of decision making is.
Yeah.
Like me observing how you built everything here, how important that speed of decision making is.
Yeah.
Because so many times, and like I'm I'm notorious for doing this in my life, and I see it now, like with when I'm talking to people about real estate, is that they'll spend so much time analyzing something on whether or not it's a good deal, that so much time goes by that then the deal is either lost, or like you overanalyze to the point where you're just becoming fully inactive.
Yeah.
You're not doing anything about the actual property.
Yeah. Something that I actually fall victim to with respect to real estate is this, and it still even happens, but we're fucking human, right? What are we gonna do? But what'll happen is I'll come across a property, I like it, I don't love it, but I like it, and I'll procrastinate a little bit. And I know why I'm doing it. Mm-hmm. I'm procrastinating a little bit because I'm like, oh, I don't love it, but I like it. And then all of a sudden, someone else is in the picture, or like, hey, we're under contract. And then I get like, well, how aggressive are they? Hey, well, I bring this to the table. Maybe we can kind of like weasel our way in there. Mm-hmm. So you gotta, everybody's falls victim to getting emotional.
Yeah.
Especially, humans are creatures of competition, right? So as soon as, someone else comes into the picture, you automatically, want to compete, right? It's in my nature, especially in my nature.
Becomes more desirable.
It's like when a 5 out of 10 walks into the bar and you notice her and you're like, eh. And then your buddy's like, man, she's fucking hot. And then you're like, wait a minute. She actually is kind of hot, right? Like it's the same shit.
Yeah,
it's exactly the same shit. So when you're like, my mentality is, when I kind of procrastinate or I don't really jump on something and I'm like, it's not okay. And then I know someone else is actually interested. Then all of a sudden that 5 out of 10 is no longer a 5 out of 10, right? So it's in our nature to do it. It's probably never going to end. But what I'm doing now is, even if I find myself doing that, then I know right off the hop that it's probably not the one for us. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you, and I somewhat disagree with you. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I somewhat disagree with you, and maybe you could tell your buddies this is something that I actually used to my advantage in the beginning of my real estate I guess you can call it career. When things were bad in the market and you were actually competing for renters, those little things did matter. Yeah. So the reason why they mattered was because there was so much product on the market that when they went into your property and there was little things like that they noticed, it set you apart, differentiated yourself. You got to think, like, at the end of the day, real estate's a product, right? So if you have a differentiating factor when someone walks into your property in the same price range, within the same area, location, whatever, that they're expecting, but they maybe see a really nice tile that might emotionally attract them to that property, it might set you apart. So maybe for that $100 little bullshit tile job that you did, it might gain you the tenant in a hard market, but we're not in that kind of market,
right?
So it doesn't necessarily matter right now.
We might come to that kind of market in a few years, who knows? But what have you found, like, when we are in that type of market where you are trying to compete for that renter's business? What were the things that you found made the biggest impact? Let's say in a specific asset class, let's say like a B class property. What were the things that you noticed had the most impact on like getting the attention of the renters for the lowest investment?
Fresh paint.
Yeah.
That's it.
Something simple as that.
Something, it's fresh paint. Everything's working.
Yeah.
Hardware's not painted over. I hate that shit. If you are a new landlord, make sure you never paint over the hardware, even if your hardware already is existing.
Now you're talking about like kitchen hardware or
anything. Like I'm talking about like door hinges, like mostly door hinges. You'll see a lot of door hinges are always painted over, and I hate that shit. I can't stand it.
Yeah.
It makes your a couple things ended up happening, right? Like when you paint over stuff that's moving, paint doesn't like to move, so it's gonna flake off. And it makes it start to look, it wears a lot quicker. So I would actually, I've done this in, maybe in the low end type rental market, doesn't matter. But when you're talking about B stuff, which the majority around here is pretty B, you don't really want to be any lower than a B.
Yeah.
You're going to have a lot of problems. But if I did have painted over hardware, I usually replace it. I can't stand that. Like,
and it's so cheap to replace.
Yeah.
Like even if
I
you're
really don't
looking
like
at
it.
a more modern, let's say like black door hinges and like a
Yeah.
handle, like a package for like that for
Yeah.
one door is so cheap.
Yeah. So
Like, relatively.
I would recommend even changing that stuff out. I don't know how to explain it. It gives that kind of, and here's this might be actually a small differentiating factor, because the majority of people will paint over it, and those little things matter to respectable tenants, right? Because if they're respectable, they're bringing people over, they want to be proud where they live. They still have respectable tenants have some sort of pride of ownership, right? Where they are going to have people over, they know people, right?
Yep.
They're not, all their buddies aren't crackheads like in a D location or D property, so they're going to bring respectable. If they're a respectable tenant, they're going to bring respectable people over, and they want their place to be presentable. Painting over hardware like that is not a presentable situation. So I like to replace that kind of stuff if it's already been painted over. In some cases I haven't, but it is what it is.
I think another thing that I'm noticing now that I'm kind of in a few is not necessarily the quality of the material, but the quality of the installation is huge.
Yeah.
Like you can do, for example, like a cheaper tile, but if it's installed perfectly symmetrical, all the grout lines are perfectly symmetrical, it's caulked well, like that makes a really big difference. And you can have an expensive tile that's not installed with that kind of like attention to detail, and it looks like shit.
Yeah. Something else that I would really recommend too is when you're going into a rental or you're cleaning it up for another tenant or whatever, is like change the caulking. Nobody wants to go, like the problem is with caulking, when it gets all moldy and shit, it looks like actual shit, right? It looks like poop, like actual poop, right? Or something is like, number one, extremely unhealthy, or two, if you touch it, you're going to end up with some fucking disease. But caulking is actually very hard to, once you start getting a little bit of moisture or bacteria growing in like a pocket of like uncaulked area that it can sit, it starts to fester and creates a big problem. But it's so easy to take out and so easy to redo. I'd recommend, if you even see a little bit of that kind of shit, redo it, or at least go over it again to cover it. Like that needs to happen. Like a clean caulking job is very important as well. Like those are little things that people will look at, especially in kitchens and bathrooms, right? Those are typically what sells the property. Yep. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that those things are taken care of, because nobody wants to actually see that. You got to understand, when people walk through their potential homes, they imagine themselves in there. They're going to imagine them taking a bath or cooking food next to this moldy shit. They're not going to like it. So take care of the caulking job. Take care of the caulking job. Don't paint over hardware. And it's a good idea, probably at least to, if you have a high traffic area and there's a lot of, discolored paint in certain areas, maybe you don't have to paint the whole unit, but a quick paint job goes a long way. Another thing that I really recommend is paint all of your rentals the same color. That way you can buy paint in bulk. We buy big 5-gallon drums of paint, and we don't allow tenants to paint their own shit, because when a tenant leaves, you're not having to have to prime. Then you're not having to have to paint 2 times, because you're trying to get rid of this fucking black wall here that somebody decided to paint, right? We use pretty much like an off-white type color. When someone leaves, more often than not, it's one coat, they're in and out really quick, my guys, and it's a very cheap way to brighten the place up. Also, obviously, lighter paint brightens the place up, makes it feel a little bit bigger. So that's what I would do. But those things, I would say that those things do matter a little bit, especially when you're in a tight market. When you're not in a tight market, obviously anything goes. But another thing that's worth mentioning is when you have a tightened up place like that, a good tenant will tend to keep it cleaner. Have you ever walked into somebody's house and it was like really dirty or not well taken care of, and say you go to wash your hands or whatever, and this is actually something that I notice a lot of people doing. I'll walk into some of my buddies' houses, and they have nice homes. And I've walked into other people's, not necessarily my buddies, but other people's homes, and they weren't so nice, or it was very disorganized. And when you go to the bathroom, the hand towel is like nicely folded. What do you usually do when it's nicely folded?
You'll like use it and then make sure it's like
Nicely folded again.
back to where it was.
Exactly. So that's the type of mentality that people will tend to, even if it's not their own stuff, they'll tend to take care of it if it's well presented to them from the beginning, right? So you have to keep that mentality as well when you're renting to people, at least to some extent. Again, it's not their home. Tenants tend to be a little bit harsher, you know, in rental units. But if you do have a respectable tenant and a decent tenant, they'll tend to take care of your place better if it was already taken care of. And if you respect them to the point where they feel like you're also taking care of it for them. That's important.